Excellent. We're recording so I can post it. So the other time that we learned about Lazarsfeld was in the context of the essay that he wrote with Merton, which is what this question is referring to. Lazarsfeld and Merton were, and do we have a page in the course pack? If you're there right now, maybe you can give a shout out to what page this is on. 62, great, okay. So Lazarsfeld and Merton were responding to all of the folks who were adamant that media effects were all powerful and dangerous and strong. They're really talking to folks who embrace the hypodermic needle sense of the influence of media, or that direct, powerful effect philosophy, that media are all powerful, that media are going to brainwash people, right? That was their fear. So what Lazarsfeld and Merton say is that's probably not accurate, mainly because of the ownership structure of media, especially in the United States. So they talk about a couple unique effects of media that do exist, but that are not super strong and super persuasive. They talk about the status conferral function of media, which now we refer to as the agenda setting effect. The status conferral function of media is the notion that when media talk about a particular issue or a crisis or a person, they confer status onto that thing, meaning they then define that that thing is important. They declare that it's important. Just by virtue of the fact that media are talking about it, that means it is important, okay? They also say that media can be useful in reinforcing social norms. So when we witness things on television, we witness the way people behave, it generally is a reminder of what kinds of behaviors we as a society think of as normal and customary, okay? In that way, they actually suggest that because of all this and because media are designed to appeal to us and the way we already are, that media are not going to actually brainwash us and have direct effects on our behaviors in giant transformative ways. Remember where our field came from. Remember that in the early 1900s, there was a real fear about the potential and the assumed powerful effects of media on people. This was just, it just seemed intuitive that if you have this broadcasting system that can send first text, then audio words, then visuals to millions of people, that that would necessarily be a profound and impactful phenomenon. And so what Lazarsfeld and Merton are doing in this 1948 essay is saying, just because it seems possible does not mean that that's actually what's going to happen. And so instead they say, this is important in point 3 on page 62, since media are supported by great business concerns, right? At the time, they're talking mainly about radio, and they're really talking about the same broadcast networks we have today, ABC, CBS, NBC, that started as radio broadcasts. They're basically saying here, these are great business entities. Businesses are tied to and rely upon the same social and economic system that we do. So therefore, these are business entities that are necessarily going to reinforce the economics and the societal norms and the power hierarchies that already exist, right? It would not be in the best interest of these corporations to completely upend society in some new and different way. It just wouldn't make sense. So they're arguing that we shouldn't be surprised, actually, that these media messages and media content is far better at reinforcement, is far better at fueling conformism than it is at creating change. So that's a long way of answering Gina's question. Who are they responding to? They're really responding to those original scholars, usually sociologists, who assumed that there would be strong, powerful, like almost brainwashing effects of media, okay? Next up, oh, this is a good question. So last week, when you did the section on newspapers and journalism and the norms of journalism and how they're changing, I spent a lot of time talking about the crisis in the newspaper industry. And by the way, in the context of the current economic crisis, newspapers are in even worse shape because the economy is faltering. What that means is that there are fewer dollars to go towards advertising revenue anyway. And so even in the last few weeks, we've seen massive layoffs and massive cuts in the newspaper industry, especially in local newspapers across the nation. So even though this was recorded a year ago, this is still hugely, even increasingly relevant right now. This specific question is, how did the finances of the newspaper industry in the 70s relate to the ability of Woodward and Bernstein to engage in Watergate reporting? I'm actually going to send this out to you guys, so you can unmute yourself or you can put it in the chat, because I'm really interested to see how you see this. How do you see that the economics of newspapers in the 1970s were related to the ability of Woodward and Bernstein to do this time-consuming and resource-heavy kind of reporting that was necessary for Watergate? Does anyone want to take that on? Let me ask a specific question to get us started on this. In the article by Probitz that was before Watergate could be Googled, which I just love this piece, right? Bob Woodward was talking with students at Yale who were assuming that because the internet has all this information, something like Watergate, a conspiracy like Watergate, would break so much more quickly. And the whole point of that piece was that no, that couldn't happen today because, and I was so psyched as I was grading your reading questions from last week, most of you totally got this. They were underestimating the importance of what? And I know you know it because you got it right.
Old-fashioned reporting.
Good. Anthony says old-fashioned reporting, especially including what resource and what practice.
Was the answer you were looking for that one like human resources?
Yeah, human sources, meaning they had to take the time to cultivate these really deep, trusting relationships with original sources, the people who saw whatever the thing was that was going on. That takes time to develop those relationships. You know, you don't just call someone up and say, hey, I heard that you saw something totally illegal. Would you go on record as saying what that was? It takes hours and hours of relationship building. Okay, so what was it about the economics of newspapers at that time that I would argue, and I think they would argue, makes it far more likely that that kind of reporting would have happened then than will happen now? Well, let's go here. What do we know happened in the 80s and 90s to the newspaper industry?
Newspaper chains?
Good. First, the first step here economically was the consolidation of newspapers into chains, which you should recognize as just another example of economies of scale and consolidation of media ownership. So we talk a lot about consolidation of media ownership. Remember at the beginning of the class, back when we saw each other in person, we talked about how it used to be that there were like 50 different media companies that owned 90% of our media products. And now we have 5 joint corporations that own 95% of media products. Because of economies of scale, it's far more efficient. You make far more money when you have a giant consolidated corporation. Okay, so newspaper chains started in the 1980s and 90s as part of that same trend. And the reason that that was possible was because of the same deregulation policies that you might recall happened under the Reagan administration in the 1980s. So that was the first step here, is newspaper chains, okay? In the last decade, the crisis in the economics of the newspaper industry has gotten worse because of a different kind of entity taking over the newspaper industry. What is that? What is different in the newspaper industry right now in terms of who is buying newspapers, local newspapers?
They're owned by like the larger entities that like basically took over the smaller newspapers.
Good. Now they're larger entities. What's important about this, Riley's right, they're larger entities that have taken over smaller newspapers. What's key here is that these are large entities that are not exclusively in the newspaper business. They're not newspaper entities. They are investment firms. They're venture capital firms. They are entities that are designed to create profit for stock shareholders. That is key because it means that they don't really have a commitment to journalism. They don't have a commitment necessarily to the public good. They have a commitment to minimizing costs, maximizing profit, and increasing revenues for the people who own stock in their companies, which is not to like throw shade at them. Like that's what they're for, right? If I were a stockholder in one of those corporations, I would hope that they would be making decisions that would be maximizing my investment. So what that means though is without a commitment to journalism and with a commitment to generation of profit for shareholders, they are squeezing these newspapers. When you're cutting costs and you're maximizing profit, staffs get cut, which we talked about and you read about in that piece, that the reduction of staffs as a result of these mergers is largely what is responsible for the devolution, the de-evolution of newspapers into these, what they call ghost papers that have very, very little actual editorial content, very little reporting content at all in them. And part of that is because there are very few people who are funded to work at these newspapers. It takes people and it takes time and it takes a willingness on the part of a publisher to dedicate time, money, and resources to original journalism in order to make the magical stuff of news. Like that's what news is. So to answer this question, Gina, how did the finances of the paper industry in the 70s relate to the ability of the Watergate reporting? In the 70s, that was the high point in American newspapers. The circulation of newspapers was huge. Newspapers, you had many different newspapers that were owned independently. A lot of them were family owned and published. So you didn't necessarily have a newspaper chain that owned gazillions of papers around the country. Instead, you had one company running one paper dedicated to one community to which it was loyal and needed to serve. So the Washington Post had a commitment on the part of its publisher and its editor to support Woodward and Bernstein as they went about hours and hours and hours of research that was super expensive, and they didn't always have a story, right? Because it took a lot of time. So imagine today working for an entity where you say, look, I'm just going to be researching for like a few weeks. I'm not really going to have anything to publish, so hope that's cool. And they're like, sure, you can just, I don't know, visit with people and develop relationships for a full month until you have something to write. That would be too expensive right now for a newspaper to take on.
I have a
People are
question.
having a hard time getting into the Zoom. It's not letting them in. I think I'm letting everyone in. Uh-oh. Okay, yes. Yes, I will post on Canvas. If folks can't get in, if you have a friend who's in this class like, I can't get into the Zoom, just tell me and I will happily let them in. It might take me like 30 seconds before I go in and hit them. But you guys can also just drop into the chat. Hey, let them they're in the waiting room, and I will happily let them in. Questions about that, the relationship. Honestly, this is why I talk about the Watergate situation, not just because it's like this crazy, sexy story and it's what got Nixon impeached, although it is all those things, but also because it is illustrative of the economics of newspapers at that time. And to look at that as a comparison to how things are now is really kind of jarring. So that's really why
I have a question out of like
yeah,
curiosity. Like,
sure. Who am I
so
talking to? Oh, that's Anthony. Hi,
Anth-
Anthony.
hi. So if like if newspapers and like not newspapers but news in general is becoming like more and more less localized and like people
Yeah.
aren't getting like information about their local government, do you think
Mhm.
that plays a role into like kind of how like it's a very polarized political landscape nowadays because of the fact that people are more concerned about like national issues and not
Yes,
necessarily like
yes.
getting any information on like what is locally happening around them, which in theory is pretty much like it's kind of more important of like what's going around you more than what it
Yes.
is like in the
This is, Anthony, this is a great question. I'm going to say the kinds of questions that you ask tell me that you are someone who is really kind of interested in politics and stuff. And there are some courses that I think would be really interesting for you, and you should email me because there's a bunch of stuff that I think would be interesting for you. So to answer Anthony's question, yes, here's the deal. The absence of credible, trusted local journalism at the level of communities and neighborhoods and towns has devastating effects, not just because you can't figure out what's going on in City Hall, not just because there's no way for you to keep tabs on the possible corruption or whatever in your town, but also because people end up then feeling as though they have no voice. When you are not tied to your local community's goings on, instead, then you tune into national news, like Anthony said. Everything is about the national spectacle. Everything is about the national news. Everything is about Donald Trump. That gives you the impression that, first of all of politics is just a show. It's all a spectacle. And you definitely don't feel like you have a voice in that process because it is far less likely for you to be able to affect change at that level than it is for you to be able to affect change at the level of your town or your community or your county. So when people are able to keep tabs on things in their neighborhoods, in their communities, and in their counties, they end up feeling a sense of political efficacy, it's called, which means that you have confidence that your voice is going to affect change. And you, as a result, have more trust and faith in the system. When people have trust and faith in the system, they are less likely to make really bad political decisions, and they're more likely to support democratic institutions. So there are all kinds of trickle-down effects of having no local papers, which is why I beat that drum so hard. So that's a good question. And political polarization is among those negative outcomes, by the way. You're absolutely right. Let's talk a little bit. Number 3 here, Gina asked about examples of the two-step flow. And I also saw a question from Shayna about the difference between third variables and moderating variables, which I think all of those things we can kind of talk about together. Remember the People's Choice Study. The People's Choice Study was done in Erie, Ohio, and it was an attempt to understand, this was early, this was like in the 30s, or maybe it was 1940, but it was, again, an attempt to understand whether or not media effects were really powerful, because that is what people thought at that time. So they were going to test the effects of campaign materials on public opinion towards political candidates. What they found, instead of strong effects of campaign materials persuading people who to vote for, and when I say campaign materials, there were no TV ads. We're talking about pamphlets, advertisements in newspapers, and little brochures that were passed out, okay? What the researchers found was that there was very little evidence of direct persuasion as a result of exposure to campaign materials. Instead, we'll talk about the two-step flow in a second, okay? But first we're going to talk about selective exposure, selective perception, selective retention. What that means is, what they found was that people were significantly more likely to seek out information about the candidate that they already liked in the first place, right? So they were less likely to see information for the candidate they hated. They were more likely to interpret news stories in ways that were consistent with their pre-existing opinions of the candidates. So if you read a story about the two candidates, you're going to come away from that story feeling like, oh, yeah, that made my candidate look really good. Okay, that's selective perception. And selective retention is only remembering the good things about your side, only remembering the good things about your candidate. Okay, now, hold on, let me put that aside for a second. The other thing that they found in that study was what they called the role of opinion leaders. Okay, opinion leaders are individuals who live in a community or in a social context who the opinion leaders themselves watch media. Their opinions are directly influenced by media, but most of the people in the community are not tuned into media. Instead, most of the community goes to the opinion leaders and says, hey, what do you think about this thing? This is important because it suggested that media effects were not direct. They talked about this as an indirect effect of media, right? Where the content of media and the effect of media went through opinion leaders. And the second step, the two-step flow, was that the opinion leaders then affected the beliefs and attitudes of the people around them. Okay? The reason I'm talking about this, and I'm linking this with the other question about moderating variables, is because this is something that indicates that media effects are not all powerful, that they depend on these other things. Okay? They depend on context, and they depend on these characteristics of the audience. So remember when I talked about selective exposure, selective perception, and selective retention, okay? What's important here is that political party, or which candidate you like in the first place, would serve as moderating variables that are going to affect how exposure to a campaign brochure is going to then shape your attitude. If exposure to the campaign brochure is an X variable, and your attitude towards the candidate is a Y variable, the relationship between X and Y is going to be very different for a Republican than it would be for a Democrat. And that is the magical equation of moderating variables. When you can say the effect of exposure on this outcome is different for these kinds of people than it is for these kinds of people, that is illustrative of a moderating variable, meaning there is some variable that is moderating, okay, changing, filtering, buffering the effects of X on Y. Does that help? Okay, so third variables are different because third variables are those constructs that exist behind the scenes. And when you're doing a survey, a cross-sectional survey, and you find a correlation between two things, it is very possible that those two things are merely correlated because there is a third variable, an underlying thing that is causing both X and Y. Third variables exist outside of the relationship between X and Y, almost behind it. For moderating variables, these are things that operate almost as, okay, I'm very visual, so I'll just say this. A moderating variable, I think of as like a car wash. Have you ever been in one of those automatic car washes? Where like, it's like something that changes the effects of X on Y, okay? It's like you go, this thing buffers the effects of X on Y. What could it be? Oh, I know. Oh, how about this? This will work for you. The car wash was bad. How about this? Sunscreen. Bam. Sunscreen is a moderating variable that changes the effects of the sun on your skin. That's it. Can we get a little applause up in here with a little hand emoji? Sunscreen is a moderating variable that changes the effects of sun on your skin. That's it. I only got 4 applauses. Listen, listen, people, it is hard to be so lively in front of a computer screen. Okay. I'm hoping that helped you. Social media platforms. Gina says, number 4, how are social media platforms regulated? The reason that this is a hard thing to answer is because they're not. They're really not. Yeah, no. What you guys are all going to learn about, if you haven't already taken COMM 370, which I don't think many of you have, there are different theories of press regulation. And in the United States, our philosophy of press regulation is about freedom of the press. Our philosophy of media regulation is to not regulate it, because our sense is that people are good and rational, and so more speech is good. And as a result, social media are very, very rarely regulated. I may come back to that in a minute, but I have some other questions up in here too. Here's that, did that. The study guide about Facebook. Absolutely. Let's talk about Facebook. Study guide about Facebook. Do you mean the review sheet for exam 2 about Facebook, or do you mean the questions on Canvas that you replied to about the documentary? I'm happy to answer.
I was thinking, sorry, I asked this question. I was wondering if we could just talk about the like the pretty large section on the study guide on page 2 about Facebook, just because between the lecture and the documentary, I'm like might be getting some things like mixed up in my brain.
Sure.
So if you could just that.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Okay, so there are a couple things that I highlight a lot in my conversation about Facebook. I am very critical of Facebook. I don't think Facebook is evil. I don't think Facebook is malicious. But I think Facebook has been very interested in ignoring some of the negative implications of their platform. So a couple things that I want you to take away. Number 1, this first question here under Facebook on the review sheet. How did Zuckerberg describe the responsibility that Facebook has for content on its platform? For the longest time, up until 2 years ago, Facebook described itself as not responsible for the content that is shared on its platform, right? Facebook described itself as merely a platform through which people could connect, a platform for people to share user-generated content. And as such, Facebook itself was not responsible for information that was shared on its platform. That became a little bit of a problematic claim as Facebook grew and grew and grew. And as Facebook was able to mobilize people, and it was clear that it was mobilizing people. And as you saw in the documentary, the Arab Spring revolutions in Tahrir Square in Egypt, where Facebook was used as a mechanism through which people could connect, and it spawned this revolution. Now, Facebook is not responsible for the Egyptian revolution. That would be crazy. However, Facebook was used to facilitate the physical actions of revolution, meaning who, what, when, where, why, where are we going to gather, what are we going to do? And that was very clear, and everyone witnessed that happen. So it was tricky then afterwards for them to continue to deny influence when that same platform could be used to mobilize bad things. I talk a little bit in the lecture about the rumors and false information in Myanmar, where there is a Rohingya minority. It's a population, a religious population that becomes the victims of like a quasi-genocide because they are the subjects of rumors and hate and lies that are spread on Facebook. And of course, the conversation about how Russia was able to use Facebook as a way to share mis and disinformation and try to reduce turnout among certain populations in the United States in 2016. Okay. a question about why does Facebook always talk about their scale? When I had gone to meet with them, it just shocked me that every single presentation by every Facebook executive started with a conversation about the billions of users. They kept showing this number, billions of users. And then I realized the reason that they keep talking about everything at scale is so that you, as a possible critic, will start to think, ooh, it might be too challenging and complex and difficult to engage in certain kind of regulations simply because they're so big. That is my takeaway, is that is why they're talking about the billions of people who are using it. Because once you start talking about the need to regulate content, or the need to regulate hate speech, or the need to regulate harmful speech, they'll say there are 75 gigabillion posts per day, meaning how are we ever possibly going to regulate that much content? So that is why they talk about at scale. I think it's to sort of get people to quiet down about regulation, because it just is so difficult in terms of its feasibility. Let's see here. Great, hold on a second. Community standards. There's a whole section in that lecture about community standards at Facebook. And the thing to remember too, which was a question on the reading questions, was the tension between safety and voice, right? That's a big one, safety and voice. So they want to be able to give people a voice, but they also are trying to figure out how to protect people's physical safety. Now, emotional safety is a whole other thing. I mean, I don't know that emotional safety is something that they're trying to protect in their users, but physical safety is something that they're trying to protect. But it's always tricky, because how do you protect physical safety and still honor the need for people to exercise their voices on the platform? Geo-blocking, we talked about this because they, you know, when Facebook talks about how, you know, we do not regulate content, we do not take things down based on ideology or whatever, we don't block mis or disinformation of certain kinds. What ended up happening was that it became clear as we learned about how Facebook is regulated in other countries that that's a choice that they're making. That in Germany, it is illegal to deny the reality of the Holocaust. It is a federal crime in Germany to deny the reality of the Holocaust. And so if you have an IP address in Germany and you are engaging in certain kinds of Holocaust denying speech, that content will be blocked. Actually, meaning if I'm a Facebook user in Germany and I'm friends with somebody from another part of the country where you can be a person who says the Holocaust didn't happen, that's fine. Somebody says that on Facebook, if I live in Germany, that content will be geo-blocked and I will not be able to see it. So the reason this is important, because it shows that Facebook has made choices about how it is going to comply with the regulations of other countries. So it's not that it's technically not feasible for them to block content, it's that they have chosen how to and the extent to which to comply. Let me go forward a little bit. There were some questions about how Facebook changed once Sheryl Sandberg joined the company. This is important because the economics of Facebook are really what has driven some of the problematic things over the last 2 years, especially. So Sheryl was charged with trying to figure out, how do you make money from Facebook? Facebook is giant. Everyone has it. We all use it for free. How do they make money? And that was even more important as they had the initial public offering, which otherwise known as an IPO, where Facebook was put on the stock exchange where people could publicly buy stock in Facebook. As soon as a company has an IPO, it means that people are going to be investing in that company, and the company has a fiduciary responsibility to generate profit for their shareholders every day. How do we do that? Well, if you're Sheryl Sandberg, you start thinking creatively about ways to use the infrastructure of Facebook to make a profit. What are some ways that they did that at Facebook?
Was that when they were working with the other groups and releasing your previous information, like search history, to find the so for like ads and such?
Excellent. Riley says, was this when they started working with other groups? Yes. They started working with these large data brokerage firms that basically have information about every single one of us, all of our consumer habits out in the world. And the reason that that's important is that Facebook doesn't have access to like what you bought at the Gap or like the grocery store. However, by partnering with data brokerage firms, they could link together your behaviors offline with your behaviors online. They also started using cookies to track your behaviors all over the internet. So when you leave Facebook, they are still tracking you, okay? And that is true of the platform today. That means that it's not just that Facebook is gathering the data that you share and things you like and whatever. It's actually gathering all of this sociological and psychological and consumer information about you everywhere you go. So that's one. And then the other thing is, one of the ways that is able to use that to make a ton of money is that by having all of this micro level data about you, and not just like that you're a man or a woman, that you're 18, that you live in this zip code, like, okay, that's so like 1990s level sophistication. Instead, they have an understanding of what it means that someone is the kind of person who, when they leave Facebook, they go to this kind of news site to receive information. They spend this much time on email each day. They like pictures of this kind of dog. You know, once they have that level of understanding of individuals, the opportunity for micro targeting of advertisements is amazing. And by the way, the linking with the data brokerage firms and using cookies to follow us all over is why, after I have looked up my new sneakers on Kohl's.com and like trying to figure out, okay, so which sneaker am I going to get? That's why Facebook then is all filled with ads of sneakers from Kohl's.com, right? I mean, I'm sure you experience this all the time and you're like, is somebody looking over my shoulder? Well, kind of, yeah. But this is really efficient for corporations who are trying to not advertise to everyone. They want to advertise to exactly the right people for exactly the right products that they already know that they want. So that is how Facebook makes mucho dinero, by corporations paying them for the sophisticated use of all this data, right? Now remember, Facebook is not lying when they say we do not sell your data. They don't. They don't sell it. They allow advertisers to use it in a very sophisticated way by saying the kinds of people that they would like to reach. And then Facebook goes in, it's like, oh, we know how to reach them. And then they do. That's how that works. Any other questions on Facebook? I see other questions in here. Does the exam start on page 51? Yes, it does. Page 51 in the course pack. Correct. Jen says, after this exam, is there any more work due? Yes, there is. The final week is going to be a compressed section on TV and film. And it's a very fun, in my mind, I think everything is fun, but you're going to learn about what Nielsen ratings are. You're going to learn about the television rating system. You're going to learn about the movie rating system, some fundamentals about how these industries work. And you're also going to learn about one of the most significant kinds of media effects that is still researched today, which is called the cultivation theory. I think some of you may have learned about cultivation theory in 256. You will continue learning about cultivation theory at different levels of sort of sophistication through your work in the COMM department. So I'm going to talk about cultivation theory as it was originally introduced and some of the evidence that point to cultivation effects through television. Yes, so that will be In terms of the work that is due that week, let me see. I don't know. I'm not sure. That's a good question. That's a good question. I think that last week there's just questions on the lecture viewing. That's it. So just because I feel like we're ready to wind down and we're ready to like, right? We're ready to wind down. I think we're ready to wind down. Let me make sure I have that right here. I don't want to lie to you. Don't want to lie to you. Yes. All you have after this exam is one single 5-point lecture question assignment. And that's all. Isn't that great? That's it. No, nothing else. Where's my Zoom chat? Where'd it go? Zoom chat. Oh, there you are. Okay. Hold on. Okay. Oh, Ted, good question. Isn't that still kind of selling data? Well, sure it is, Ted. It is kind of selling data, but they can say we're not actually selling your data because they're not actually giving the advertisers the full data set. They're saying, you tell us who you want to reach and we will use the data to find them, but they're not selling the data. It's very tricky. What page should we stop at in the course pack for the exam? I don't know. I don't know, Aaliyah. Let me find out. Oh, Stella. Stella with the answer, page 85. She's right. Listen to Stella. She's 1000% correct. Okay. Yeah, 51 to 85 in the course pack is exam 2. Yeah. Can we talk about Al Gore? Everyone wants to talk about Al Gore. Matthew, Jessica. I don't think that Al Gore has ever wanted to be talked about. That's not the right wording. I don't know that anyone has been as eager to talk about Al Gore as folks in this chat. Awesome. We want to talk about how he was vice president for 8 years, or how in 2000 when he was running for president and he said, I had a hand in the invention of the internet. And then the Bush campaign took that and ran with it and said, this guy's crazy. He thinks he invented the internet. When really what he was saying was technically true. Who wants to chime in about the role that Al Gore played in, maybe not inventing the internet, okay, but in the development of the internet? What did our friend Al do before he was the big environmental guy who did that documentary, The Inconvenient Truth, about climate change? Who wants to take a stab at it? Here's a hint. Here's a hint. It was the 1980s, okay? And there had already been research coming up with these routers and the backbone of the internet, right? They had started to create the technology, you know, because during the Cuban Missile Crisis, it was clear that we needed a way to decentralize control of information, blah, blah, blah. Al Gore is a young senator, and he is trying to convince his fellow senators, Gina, yes, Anna, yes. Oh, wait, another audience. Internet is so sweet to info. He released a lot of his campaign. Okay, close. So what Al Gore did was, as a young senator, he early on saw that the internet is an inherently democratizing tool, meaning the internet connects people to other people and provides a feedback loop through which individuals can communicate back to the message sender. As a result, it is something that will empower people. It will reduce the power differential between elites and individuals, which is automatically something that is empowering and democratizing. Okay. So what he did was he worked to develop this plan to give giant financial grants through the National Science Foundation, which is a government agency, taxpayer-funded agency. Gore worked to have National Science Foundation grants that would be awarded to large universities and research centers to create additional servers to help expand the backbone of the internet, to help build it out. And that then is what changed the internet from just like 5 little hubs to the big infrastructure that then we came to know by the end of the 80s, early 90s. So he did actually have a hand in the development of the internet. He didn't invent it, no, but he did have a hand in developing it. So when I give a little bit of pushback on Al, it's because early on, many of us, Al Gore and myself, thought that the internet was inherently democratizing and it would cause all kinds of amazingly good, all good things to happen. The problem is, any kind of media technology is going to be only as good as the people who use it, as the people who create content and share that content through it. So when you have rogue entities and bad actors sharing disinformation, sharing information that is hurtful or racist or anti-democratic, then it's not necessarily going to be an inherently democratizing technology. It's just not. And that's not the technology's fault. It is the fault of those who are using it. However, it also invites the question of the extent to which governments should be looking at ways to regulate this infrastructure so that it can contribute in a positive way to democratic health. Does that help with Al Gore? No? Yeah? He also ran for president in 2000 and he lost in Florida. We didn't have the results of the election forever because there was a big snafu. Did y'all know this? You know this story? Crazy story. It's crazy times. Yeah. Okay. More questions. I'm happy to stay on a little bit if you got more.
What was the vision of Facebook, or what is?
The vision of Facebook. I think Stella has it up in the chat here. People use Facebook to stay connected with friends and family, to discover what's going on in the world, to share and express what matters to them. So this is their revised vision. The one that they say over and over again in the documentary is like, connect people and empower them to share. I think something like that. Connect people and empower them to share. So the reason that that's important, the reason I asked that question was because it kind of brings home one of the other questions that I asked you, which is the vice president for public good, who was quoted in the documentary in terms of like what they spent too much time thinking about at Facebook and not enough time thinking about. They were really focused on the good that Facebook does, and they weren't focused enough on the possible bad. And I think that their vision, they really, really believe in the power of connecting people. And I respect where that comes from. I think, just sort of me off the record, but I'm not off the record because we're recording this. But I think part of this comes from maybe needing to have more like social scientists, sociologists, psychologists, political scientists working at Facebook in the early years, because there were a lot of really brilliant tech people, really brilliant computer scientists. But if you can create a technology, that doesn't mean that you're going to have a really thorough understanding of human nature and human behavior to understand how that technology is going to be used by actual people. And yeah, I think, you know, if some of y'all had been working there, maybe things would have been different. I don't know. Okay, some more questions down here. Oh yes, Bennett. Lance Bennett. So the first book that I ever read that was about political communication was Lance Bennett's book, News, the Politics Illusion. And it holds up so well. He's published a gazillion editions of it. It is so smart. And what I like about it is that he takes the question about whether or not news is biased and reframes it. So you hear a lot about liberal bias in media. The question is, I mean, there are a bunch of reasons why that's a questionable claim. Yes, journalists themselves tend to be more politically liberal on social issues and cultural issues, right? Journalists tend to be more liberal on gay marriage and abortion and immigration, affirmative action. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that their content will be more liberal. And more importantly, because remember Lazarsfeld and Merton's claim that media organizations are always going to be wedded to the existing economic and sort of social framework because they are benefiting from it. So why would they create content that's going to completely transform society? They won't. Well, this is my argument against those who talk about a liberal bias in media, because media are in the United States are owned and operated by large corporations, which in terms of economic policy are going to necessarily have a more conservative economic policy, meaning you're not going to have like Comcast or like, I don't know, Verizon really excited about a democratic socialist because that would be bad for them. Okay, so Lance Bennett's answer to this is like, let's shift away from the question about whether or not the media are liberal or conservative. Let's move to the question of the other kinds of biases, content biases they have that have nothing to do with politics. And he talks about the bias of fragmentation, which is that stories are presented as these discrete little nuggets of chaos that are completely disconnected from other things. Dramatization, which is that stories that have a lot of conflict are the ones that are emphasized. Stories that pit people against people, or man against nature, or man against man against self, right? Remember those themes from like literature class? Those are the stories that are emphasized. Fragmentation, personalization, stories about individuals rather than stories about the system. The reason that these things all exist is because of the economic pressures of especially television news, where the need is to have eyeballs and have ratings in order to sell advertising. So the thought is that if we just have short little nuggets of stories that are fragmented, we'll keep people's attention. And if we have stories about things that are really dramatic and sensationalized and conflict-based, it'll keep people's attention. And if we have stories about people rather than about institutions and systems, well, then it'll get more eyeballs, right? So these are the biases that he concentrates on. Yeah, and I think it's a more useful way to think about the possible negative effects of exposure, because once you start thinking about what those biases result in, you can realize, like, if the news is only going to tell stories in a fragmented way about conflict, sensationalized drama, about people, there are certain kinds of stories that are never going to be told. That means that the news is going to be very unlikely to talk about complex institutional responses to complex issues, which, if we think about that in the context of the coronavirus crisis right now, you can understand why that matters. The news is always going to have a desire to emphasize stories about Trump, stories about Dr. Fauci, stories about Dr. Birx, because talking about the sort of more abstract work of thousands of scientists around the country and agencies coordinating responses is a harder story to tell. It's not something that works as well maybe with what's going to just grab our attention and keep us sitting in front of the television all day. And that is going to then have effects on how we think about what kinds of solutions we should be looking to for these problems. When you report news in a way that is fragmented, dramatized, and personalized, the audiences are going to tend to come away thinking that the solutions to problems come from individual actors, individual politicians, or they're going to say the solution to the problem comes from individual citizens changing their behaviors, when perhaps the answer is in between. Perhaps the answers are really comprehensive policies that involve lots of people and lots of moving parts. And that does not play well in the story structure offered through news. So, long answer. What else? Can we discuss mass? Oh yeah, mass-produced paperbacks and blockbuster syndrome. I hope you all enjoyed that lecture. That's such a fun lecture to give. Oh man. So we know that the market in the book industry for certain kinds of stories is greater than it is for other kinds of stories. And does anyone remember from that lecture what kinds of books are most in demand? Does anyone remember? What kinds of books are most in demand by the public? What are most read?
Nonfiction works.
Riley's on it. Nonfiction works. So as a result, you have acquisitions editors who are always trying to find the next great nonfiction memoir, the true story of someone dealing with something awful or hard, stories of hardship and pain and suffering, and then redemption and resilience. People love those. And they love them especially when they're real. I mean, because anybody can make a story up, but to have a real story is a big deal. So one of the things that we find is there's a real pressure to get these stories. And because of that pressure, there is a inclination on the part of some writers to just make shit up. Because this could have been true. It could have happened. So there are a bunch of stories. Million Little Pieces is one. There's another one that I talk about. There's the one about, there's the woman who talked about being in a gang in central LA, and then her sister saw a story about her in the New York Times, and her sister was like, yeah, my sister didn't grow up in a gang. She went to high school with like the Olsen twins in like an elite high school. So basically, the reason I talk about all this is because there was such a rush to get these stories to print that they did not vet them enough. And that is one of the side effects of blockbuster syndrome, okay? Some other side effects of blockbuster syndrome, there is a desire to have a guaranteed winner. And this is actually true across media. This isn't just the case for books. All media are risk averse, so they really want to know that something is going to sell well. The only way you can do that is if you have a proven track record. So if you've never written a book before and you have your first novel, it's going to be really, really, really hard to get published. It just is. That's part of the blockbuster syndrome effect as well. Very difficult for first authors to get published. And again, what I said before, it sometimes results in fake stories being published as true because the business is so thirsty for these nonfiction memoirs. It also results in instances of plagiarism, where things that have been successful in the past might be inspiration, loosely defined, for folks who then want to write a similar story. So that's blockbuster syndrome. What else? Great, okay. I don't see any other ones in here. Just some general guidance for the test. Here's what's awesome. Here's what's awesome. It's open book, open note. That is awesome. Here's what else is awesome. Because it has become clear that as you take open note, as you take tests in this way, you're going to be more likely to want to look through things and take a little time researching, just to probably check your instincts. Obviously last time the hour was not enough time. So I've given you 2 hours. So that's good. That's twice as good as 1 hour. If you have DSS accommodations, those are programmed into the online exam, and you should see those accommodations honored in there. My suggestion to you is to have your course pack fully organized. Maybe also, let's see, go through, especially if I've asked a question in the lecture questions or reading questions about a topic, about a concept, that means that that's something that I am highlighting as important. So be thinking about those things as you're studying. The access to the quizzes themselves will close tonight at midnight. Okay, so you have 12 hours to get in there and scour around. But yeah, at midnight, those will close. So make sure that you get what you need out of those before then. Any other questions about the exam? It opens at 8 a.m. tomorrow. It closes at 8 p.m. on Saturday. There is no new information for the course this week. It is just studying and taking the exam. There's no new content. And then next week, you can just be chill as you watch your lecture videos about TV and, oh, it says it's due Sunday? Uh-oh, let me check that. I'll have to check that. I have programmed the exam to end at 8 p.m. on Saturday. So if it says it's due Sunday, that is a mistake, and I will change that right now. If you have now planned to take the exam on Sunday and you can't do it otherwise, please get in touch with me and I'll figure that out. Let me write this down. What was the other thing I was just gonna say? Oh yeah, the final week will be very chill, super chill, very chill. It'll just be learning about television and film and watching lecture videos and doing one small 5-point set of questions. And because we have all worked very, very hard this semester. Anything else? I'm looking in the chat here. Exam announcement. Anything
I
else?
just have a question about the presentation that you said we have an invite to for being like on the common interest path.
Oh yeah. I don't actually know any details about that, but I just thought it's
Okay.
cool. Yeah.
Okay.
That is being organized, I think, by our chair, Cami Silk, and her email's in there. I just thought it would be really fun. Apparently this person is very cool and worked for MTV for a long time, but that'd be a really fun opportunity for you. Next week is the last week. That is correct. Technically, our last day of class, I think, is Monday gosh, Danna, have a calendar here somewhere. But I don't have a calendar. Calendar.
The 18th.
Thanks. Someone just took pity on me. I appreciate that. The 18th. Yeah, so that is technically last day of class. I'm not giving you anything that day. Maybe I'll send you a funny video to watch. Maybe I'll make a meme for you. Next week is the last week of content. Awesome. Thank you all for, oh, I see a clappy clap from Yasmin. Thank you. Thank you all for coming. I miss you all so much. My kids here are very sad that I am not teaching because now I use them as my audience and I think they're over me. They're so over me. I miss y'all. Stay safe and stay sane. Get lots of exercise. Get exercise is good for you. Exercise is very good for you. And sleep.
Excuse me, Professor.
Yes. Hi, Stella.
There's someone saying that whether it has other survey extra credits will be given.
For this exam, I don't have any extra credit opportunities for this exam. However, you should see from exam 1, there were 7 points added. And then for doing the survey, there was another 5 points added to exam 1. I'll tell you what though, if these exams clearly go awry and there is some big issue and the average scores are bad, or there's a question that doesn't make sense and everyone gets it wrong, I will do what I do, which is I will go in and bump everyone because that's what I do. So, yeah, but I don't know yet because you haven't taken it.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, if I don't see any additional questions down here, I will assume that means that everyone.
Actually, I just had something really quick to say.
Yeah.
For conspiracy theories on social media, it was just that they spread so quickly because there's not really anything to
But you know what the key is? There's no gatekeepers.
Okay.
Remember how we had Biff or whatever his name was, the big gatekeeper? There's no gatekeepers. And so you can be saying the world is flat and there's no one to tell you like, you can't actually say that because it's crazy. There's no one there to say it. There's no gatekeepers. So conspiracy theories can run amok. Cool.
And then, one more thing. Lastly, on the quiz about the and it said which does not illustrate a violation of editorial independence. So for this, a magazine creates an article about celebrities with wrinkles to place next to an ad for wrinkle cream. How is that a violation of editorial independence? Because it's not, I mean, isn't that adjacency?
Adjacency? Wait, say it again. How is it worded?
It says a magazine creates an article about celebrities with wrinkles to place next to an ad for wrinkle
See, that's the
cream.
key. The magazine created the article to put next to the ad. The advertiser didn't come in, identify a pre-existing article and say, can we pay more money to put our ad there?
Mm-hmm.
If they did that, it would be adjacency. Instead, they paid the magazine extra money to write a special feature about how wrinkles are gross, so that then they could put their wrinkle cream ad in a really happy spot. That means that the editorial content was actually created for the ad.
Okay.
So that is a violation of editorial independence.
Okay. Oh, okay. All right. Got it. That was the only thing I was confused on.
What is
Sure,
the word?
sure.
What is
Yeah.
the word for making an article for the?
Oh yeah, complementary copy.
Okay.
Good. And remember, complementary copy and adjacency are very similar, but it's about what comes first. In adjacency, the content is already there. And this was something that was introduced by Ladies Home Journal, right? And they realized that, like, oh, if we let the advertisers see an early copy of the magazine, and they can see which story that they want their product advertised next to, and they'll pay more for that. Great. But in that context, the advertiser didn't dictate what the content of the article was. They just chose which one that they liked that already had been written, and they paid more to be next to it. That's my dog. Complementary copy is different because that is copy directly designed, directly created strategically to make a nice, squishy, happy home for the ad. And what better squishy home is there for wrinkle cream than an article about celebrities who look so bad because they have wrinkles?
So complementary copy and editorial, the violation of editorial independence pretty much go hand in hand.
Yes. And I think that that's what's really confusing, is because when you look at the celebrity magazines from today and Us Weekly and all those magazines, you're looking at it, you're like, wait, so it seems as though editorial independence is violated here all the time. Yes, it is. Correct. Because it's not a law. It's not like a law. It's just a practice. It's a norm that they violate. Yeah. Cool. All right, fam. It's good to see you. I didn't see any of you, but okay. It's good to know that you're in cyberspace with me. Be well, and I will see y'all soon. If you need anything, email me, dgyoung@udel.edu. Okay, ciao.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thanks so much. Take care.
Thank you, Alyssa.